This interview is part of the James J. Blanchard Living Library of Michigan Political History. Bill McLaughlin, you are the longest-serving Republican chairman in the history of the state of Michigan. It's a great pleasure to be with you here today. And I just want to start out by asking you, were you originally from Michigan?
No, sir. I was born in Syracuse, New York.
Well, how'd you end up in Michigan?
Well, I ended up in Michigan in June the 1st, 1951, when my parents moved to Detroit, and I came out with them. And
how old were you then?
I was I had just completed my freshman year in college, so I was probably 51. I was just coming on to 19.
And so why did your parents move to Detroit?
Well, my father took a job here, and and we came out. I came here intending to go back to Syracuse because I'd started my first year at Lemoyne College.
Right.
I got a job at the Ford tractor plant in Highland Park.
Okay.
I was going to save the money and go back. Unfortunately, every morning at 9 o'clock during the hot months of June and July, they walked out on a heat strike. And I never made enough money to go back, and so that's why I'm still in Michigan.
And so, were your parents Republicans?
They never told me. My assumption is yes. My assumption is yes, but they never said I'm a Republican.
So how did you become interested in the Republican Party?
I've got 4 or 5 memories that bring me up to getting interested. The first was in 1940, going across the street the day after the election and getting a quart of milk and bringing it home. My father saying Wilkie lost, and I remember being crushed. I don't know why. I didn't know.
This was back in Syracuse.
This was in Utica, New York, in 1940. Wilkie lost. The next memories I have was in Erie, Pennsylvania, sitting on our sun porch on East 31st Street, listening to 4 days of the 1948 Republican National Convention. I remember the names of Bricker and Dewey and Vandenberg, and of course Dewey was familiar because he had been the governor of my state, New York. When that thing was over, I said, God, that was exciting. I sure would like to go to one of those someday, never knowing that I'd be a delegate to 4 and an alternate delegate to 1 before I was through, and my dream came true.
Well, now, the Democrats had a pretty exciting national convention in '48 too, but you weren't listening to that?
No, for some reason...
You were already somehow getting
I must have been being molded,
and you're not really
for good
sure.
or bad, one way to...
And you weren't even sure whether your parents were Republicans. Well, anyway, so you get to Michigan. So what happened? You're working
well, what happened was in 1952, I was a great admirer of a guy by the name of Eisenhower.
Okay.
He spoke at Masonic Temple, and I went there, and that was the night he said...
In Detroit?
In Detroit. And that was the night he said, if elected, I shall go to Korea. Very pivotal in the campaign,
right.
And in history, I was there. And in 1960, I got married the latter part of October, the 29th, and we went to New York on our honeymoon. One day we're coming out of the RCA building, and the cars and the sirens are coming by, and they go flying by, and in the car was Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie, Richard Nixon and Pat, Henry Cabot Lodge, and Nelson Rockefeller. They were coming back from the ticker tape parade in New York. It was the day of campaigning in New York.
Yeah.
That night we went to see My Fair Lady, and as we were coming home, walking back to our hotel, there's a whole mob of people coming down the street. It was the people coming from the Coliseum where they'd had a rally that night.
Right.
They walked to the Waldorf Astoria. We went with them, and they stood outside the place. We want Ike. We want Ike. We want... Some bald-headed guy came to the window, and they finally left. I don't think it was Ike, but they thought it was, and they all went. So I came home, and the day after we got home was Election Day, and I went.
The Kennedy versus Nixon
Kennedy
election.
versus Nixon. I went and voted for Nixon. Janet didn't vote. She wasn't old enough to vote. So...
that's right. It was a 21-year-old vote then.
When it was all
she was still only 15.
Sorry, we were living in St. Clair Shores. When it was all over, it occurred to me, wow, I never saw anything about the Nixon race in the local papers. I was doing public relations at the time at the Music Hall Theater for Cinerama. Maybe I should go and volunteer, and that's what got me started in politics.
And how old were you then? 1960?
I was 29.
29.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got active. How'd you get active? What'd you do?
Well, I asked my brother, who was involved with the Young Republicans at UAD, how he could help me, and he put me in touch with 1 or 2 people, Lyle Van Houten, who was then the state
Right.
chair of the Young Republicans, or a guy by the name of Dan McKinnon, who was also active in I think it was McKinnon. He and I and two or three others got together in the, quote, party headquarters in downtown Mount Clemens one night in January and formed the Macomb County Young Republicans. That was an exciting time. The first elected person in the family, though, was Janet, who was elected secretary of the Macomb County.
Oh,
Young
she
Republicans.
was. Oh, she became a,
I was
a
just
chapter
somebody
officer.
else that was there, but Janet got
You were
elected.
not good. Well, that's
secretary.
good.
That's right.
Okay, so this was like...
This was in January of 1962.
62. Okay, well now, did you decide to run for office yourself?
Yeah,
At some
before the
point?
year was over, I did. But
You
it
did
was
what, for state representative?
I did for state representative.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
was it a Mount Clemens district?
It was St. Clair
St. Clair
Shores.
Shores.
It was St. Clair Shores, East Detroit, Roseville, and Fraser. It was overwhelming Democratic.
Yeah, well the whole county was very heavily
very
Democratic at that time. Who was the Democrat that you ran against?
I
Do you
ran
remember?
against a guy by the name of Joe Snyder. Joe Snyder
remember
was
Joe
an
Snyder.
organizer
Sure.
for the UAW and had been a Constitutional Convention delegate.
Right.
And this was before one man, one vote, and I was very proud. I lost by 1 million votes, but I got 20,000 votes, which is more than all but one Republican running in the state for the legislature.
Well, that's good.
and
That's
I
good.
was very proud.
Well, now, what was the Liberty Amendment? What was that?
The Liberty Amendment, and it's where I got tagged a liberal in the party, was an amendment to abolish all taxes.
Okay.
And I was asked to sign an amendment for that. I said, I can't.
Was this an attempt to have a statewide vote, a referendum on amending a constitution to abolish taxes?
This was a Liberty Amendment was a national thing to abolish
National thing.
all taxes.
Okay.
I said, how are you going to run this? I said, I wouldn't do it. I had to be a liberal then if I wouldn't sign the. And I was tabbed by.
And you never got out from under that stigma.
I
huh?
never got out, even though I thought my
Yeah.
philosophy was very conservative. I was immediately.
Well,
tagged
now,
as a
one
liberal.
other thing was going on at this time in 61, 62. A constitutional convention was being held. Did you have any involvement in that?
I did. There was a young school teacher in Warren who was running in a district. It was totally Warren for the Con delegate. And he asked me to help him, so I became his quote-unquote campaign manager. I think basically I was just doing his public relations stuff like that. There was a what was Con became the tag word for the Constitutional Convention. There was a Con candidate seminar in Lansing. I went with Dick up there. We parked the car and I started getting out, and the guy at the other car next to me opened and our two doors hit. I got out, and the man getting out of the other car was George Romney. That
Wow.
was the first time
First
I met
time you
George
met him.
Romney.
Yeah.
And looking at old pictures from after years gone by, I was surprised at the number of the candidates in that picture that I finally got to know. People like Gary Brown or J. Harold Stevens and people
Right.
like that over
Right.
the years. But that was the Con, and then we got deeply involved the following year in working like crazy to carry Con and get it enacted.
Right, in the spring of 63.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, okay, so we're forgetting or skipping over Romney was elected governor in the fall of 62.
In January of 62, I believe it was. I was at, well, to begin with, I like, if I may, I like to use my story
Yeah,
as
go ahead.
amazing. If people want to get involved in politics, there's no reason they can't get ahead.
Right.
We formed a Young Republican Club in January. In 2 weeks later or something, I went to the county convention, got elected a delegate to the state convention. It was on my way.
Right.
In January, and I got active in the party to some extent. In January of 1962, I got called to a meeting with 4 or 5 or 6, 7 other people at the home of Barbara Hoffman on a Sunday night, a blizzardly Sunday night, and I went. The whole reason for the meeting was that the people who were running Macomb County for the party had come in 1952 with Eisenhower, and they'd been sitting around to manage appointments, federal appointments, and that's all they had done for years. Okay, how do we upset Frank Lawson, who was the guy's name? We did the planning of that. And somebody that night said, we ought to start off by trying to get Romney to run for governor. And that night we formed a Romney for Governor committee, and it was the first one in the state. Being the PR person, I called all the media that night and started telling them about what we had done, which became hot news the next day.